Hello, everyone. Welcome to Human-Machine Relations. This is the podcast that explores how people and technology are shaping the future of work, creativity, and communication. Today, I'm very excited to be joined by Ben Verinder, Managing Director of specialist consultancy Chalkstream, and he's one of the leading voices exploring how artificial intelligence impacts on communication and reputation. Alongside industry veteran Stephen Waddington, Ben is the co-editor of the new Kogan Page book, AI for Public Relations, which you can see I'm still working my way through. This book looks at how the industry can actually practically and responsibly integrate AI into professional workflows. Ben's own contributions focus on managing the technical, operational, behavioral, and systemic risks of AI use. And these practical aspects feel increasingly urgent as organizations try to balance technological innovation with trust, ethics, and accountability. So today, we're going to explore what responsible AI adoption really looks like in practice and what the PR profession needs to get right if it wants to maintain trust in an AI-driven world. Welcome, Ben.
Oh, well, thank you very much for having me, Hajira. It's really lovely to be here. And that was a really lucid introduction. I hope I'm half as eloquent as you are in my responses.
No pressure. All right, let's get into it. So you've been at the forefront of conversations around AI in public relations since LLMs really took off with a bang several years ago. What sparked that interest for you?
I was doing a project for NATO in 2015, and I was looking at social and traditional media monitoring tools. And one part of that job was to see whether there was any machine learning involved. So that started me off. But also, I run an agency that does a lot of predominantly, we do a lot of reputation research, which involves a lot of long form, qualitatively heavy surveys, questionnaires, etc., with senior stakeholders, predominantly in education. And I was always looking for tools that would help us analyze data. So many years of sort of trying out different survey tools that purported to have the ability to analyze, long form qual data as well as quant. And actually, it wasn't really till the launch of the main large language models we have now that they got really good. So yeah, that's and I've got a background in ethical philosophy, so I was quite interested in the ethical side of it anyway.
Yeah, interesting. And then how did this book collaboration come about? What was the decision point that made you and Stephen Waddington believe this book really needs to exist?
We had a conversation in the field on the phone about 2.5 years ago. Both of us were quite worried. We were a part of quite a few WhatsApp groups that we felt were slightly overtly techno-optimistic, perhaps not applying critical thinking as much as they might, but we were also worried about doomerism and other parts of the industry perhaps not grasping the opportunity that AI might represent. So we were kind of thinking about trying to get 80 to 100 people maybe into a room. That was the point, to have a discussion about, applying critical thinking and ethics to artificial intelligence, because we could both see that this was going to be revolutionary for all industries, not just ours. And our main sort of thought was essentially to ensure that PR has agency in the way that AI is adopted, and AI is not something that's just done to it. That was our key thought. And then Stephen thought that the best mechanism for us to sort of gender that conversation was through a book, and he was completely right. So yeah, it's been slightly more successful than we thought it was going to be.
Well, that's not really a problem.
Well, no, and all the money goes to charity as well. So all the author profits go to Socially Mobile. So, which is lovely. And it's good PR for both Stephen and my work in terms of that. So no complaints in that regards. And it is great we've sold out the conference nearly, and to get that many people who are really, leaders and professionals to talk about this topic is just fantastic, actually. And the other reason why we decided to go when we decided to go was because we could already see trends in it's covered by the name of your podcast. We could see trends already in the human and AI relationship, and we could see that there were things that were just not going to change. Risks that were just going to stay the same because they were about humans, and there were elements like influencing the machine layer, our responsibility to broader society, GEO, obviously, well, back to GEO, but special considerations in terms of adoption, whether in-house team, agency, all this kind of stuff, evaluation and measurement, stuff like that. A lot of that is independent of the technology. It's kind of all the changes in the technology. So that's kind of why we also went with timing.
Great. And I mean, I think that that's really where the value lies. You've hit the nail on the head, is that I think that there's so much conversation, and between the people who are the you sort of doom predictors and the other ones who are insanely optimistic. There's not really a lot of practical advice, and people are sort of in a way left to try and figure it out and figure out what tools work and what tools don't work. And then the technology, that's the other thing that you touched on, is technology is evolving and developing so quickly that it's really so hard, from the time that a decision is made. I mean, I can imagine, from the point of view of an organization deciding to purchase a specific kind of tool or go all in on a tool, and then find out, once the wheels of bureaucracy trundle along and they get it in and they get people trained, and then there's something new and then it's not so relevant anymore. And that must be, I mean, incredibly risky and frustrating as well.
Yeah, Andrew Bruce Smith, who writes the second chapter of our book, because obviously it's not just us, it's brilliant contributors. He touches that not necessarily in the book, but in different blogs he writes, and in relation to, he's got examples of where he's been working with organizations who've gone all out on particularly Copilot. Yeah. And then, number one, they've found that they need supplementary tools, particularly for the communications team. But also, they're not using that tool. So you've got whole swathes of licenses that are particularly large public sector organizations that have been bought but just aren't being used. It's not an IT project, it's a people project. And exactly. And we've really got to be, and that's again, an opportunity for PR.
Yeah. And in your contribution to the book, you've split managing the risks of AI implementation into sort of the technical operational side and then the behavioral systemic aspects. Why is it important to look at it this way?
I've got to be brutally honest. I mean, you can look at it in different ways. That is more of a convenience of being able to give myself 2 chapters and hit the word mark for a chapter. That's just me being selfish. You wanted to write 2 chapters. I mean, I think it's not an unuseful framework to look through it, because the behavioural element has a deeper focus on the intricacies of human behavior, and the ways that so cognitive offloading is a classic one, where we're giving too much away to the algorithm, and we're denuding and decreasing our skills as a result. That's a classic one. It's a convenience rather than, because actually quite a lot of the technological elements have human interplay or human influence. So hallucination or whatever, it's actually they're all really, they come down to human behaviors.
Yeah, and but I do think it is a useful way to split looking at it, I think.
Well, I believe.
Yeah, and I think, looking at all the technical stuff, the nuts and bolts is one thing, but then you've got to remember, you've got to take a step back and look at the bigger picture and how all of that complexity of human behavior impacts on everything in terms of the way that we work and the way that we react to things. So when we talk about the technical operational risks in AI, what are the biggest traps that you see organizations fall into at the moment?
It depends on the type of organization that you're in. I think if you're in a highly regulated industry, and then hallucination, for instance, might be a more pernicious risk. On another day, I might talk about bias, because actually for for many organizations, bias within the training data set is another major issue. So particularly if you're not necessarily if you're involved with generative AI, but if you're an organization that's deploying predictive or analytical AI, say, an insurance firm or a CV sifting firm,
Oh,
or a
don't even get me started on that one.
Well, exactly. So, we've got a very interesting precedent going through the United States courts with Workday, and I can't remember the gentleman's name. This is somebody who submitted a job application at 1 o'clock in the morning, 1:30, and was rejected at 1:35 a.m. And that was the trigger for a case which is going through the US courts in relation to the fact that it was pretty evident that no human was involved in the decision there, and whether there was bias within the algorithmic, with the setup, either in algorithmic bias or data bias, slightly different things. But yeah, so I think it depends on the kind of organization you're in.
Yeah, and I think maybe just that, I think that there's a huge maybe lack of awareness that if people are using AI, maybe they're not all being honest about the fact that their employees are using AI, and or not being transparent.
No,
and so I think there's always the danger that people will just use AI outputs and not be aware of the role of the editor, sort of like this is the role that you have to play as someone who uses AI, is that you have to edit critically, and check very thoroughly whatever it produces, and that the output cannot really be the final, the final product. And I think that there's a lot of lack of awareness, let's say. Probably getting better, but definitely that's one to watch. And I think it's just a lot of people just rushing because they're under time pressure, and sort of saying, oh well, if I put it into AI, I'll get a quick answer, and then I'll move on to something else. So I mean, there are a lot of companies that also assume that implementing AI into workflows will make things faster and cheaper, but do you have an idea of where that assumption starts to break down in terms of in an operational sense?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of good research into this. So there's lots of factors at play here. So just to speak to that first point, you're talking about people using AI in a way that they shouldn't be doing. That's what we call that shadow AI. It's pertinent across many industries. The literature varies about the proportion, but essentially what that means, if people are using tools that they're not supposed to be using, or in ways that they're not supposed to be using, they're unlikely to adhere to any policies or governance that's in place, because for obvious reasons. So that then presents all sorts of risks inherent to that. In terms of the productivity question, there's a fantastic article or piece of research, I think it was conducted by PricewaterhouseCoopers, actually. It's published in the Wall Street Journal. It's about 5,000 people interviewed about productivity gains, essentially. And what was clear there is that they're variable depending upon where you sit within an organization. So large language models are designed to be particularly useful if you're in the C-suite. They do lots of things if you're you might think they assist with lots of tasks that you might consider to be C-suite tasks. But actually, they save you less time if you're in a more nuanced white-collar job at the chalk face kind of thing, particularly with a lot of, let's say, customer service interaction, or with very specialized elements within the job. So, and that's a considerable difference in time saving. It's also, again, and this is covered in lots of really good articles. A very good piece about this in the Harvard Business Review, about the kind of hamster wheel of productivity. Parkinson's law, Solo's paradox, elements like this mean that expected productivity gains, just because you're taking on new technology, do not materialize. They don't materialize because people just get weighted down with more work, and they don't materialize in the way that people expect because there's a jagged frontier. There's some tasks that are easy to transfer and some that are not. And actually, the trick is to work out which ones not to transfer to AI. And also, with it's also the case that, as far as Paradox suggests, that there's a hump in adopting any technology which requires training and thought and implementation, etc. And that means that you lose productivity in the short term sometimes as you get to grips with the new technology. So it's not, you've got to have a strategy, you've got to have a plan. It's got, at the moment, it's kind of still the Wild West. There's lots of experimentation without strategic deployment. So actually, we really need to be moving on to a bit more mature model. Actually, it's interesting that it's still not the case in many organizations that they've taken that strategic viewpoint.
And so that actually segues very well into the next question, which is, on the strategy side of things, if an organization decides, right, I want to be strategic about this, I want to start using AI responsibly tomorrow, what are some of the first guardrails that you would recommend that they should put in place?
Well, I set this out. I've got a model called the Bridges model, but there are lots of other really good models. They're not particularly sophisticated and they don't really need to be, but there are considerations. So in my model, it's about having a conversation. The B stands for briefing, which is having a conversation with IT, whoever's going to be buying your licenses, so that you can get some permission to buy in a basic suite of tools that a comms team might. Doesn't mean necessarily agreeing to 2 years worth of licensing, but by getting enough tools that you can experiment with, doing some basic experimentation, but with safeguards. So in a sandbox environment, you're not using the outputs, you're just literally experimenting, which is absolutely the case and required with AI, but you're not putting the pressure on yourself of having to use everything that you're deploying. It's really just there for understanding and developing your tools, your skills. At the same time, you've got some parallel tasks, which is developing your prompting and your workflow, kind of your ability to encapsulate and instruct either an agentic AI or a standard large language model. And also having some sort of team policy. I always say, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Even, a lot of people I talk to, they're waiting for a perfect organizational policy before they deploy a team policy, which is really not a good idea. No, given what we said earlier on about the technology evolving so quickly, what we need is some principles of operation amongst the team. What kind of data are you never going to put into AI if you're a comms team? What kind of things what's safe? What's middling? Where is the human intervention? What's your guardrails against hallucination? What basic processes might you put in to minimize that, such as citation and standard, all this kind of stuff? It's not very complicated or sophisticated, but in my model, there's 5-6 stages with some evaluation at the end there. But there's other models, but it's just having some critical thinking and approach and integrating sort of thought into, and you can have some individual frameworks as well there. So I've got a framework for thinking about, is this task good for AI or not? Sam Illingworth is a brilliant writer on the risks of AI. He's got some great ideas around making sure, asking yourselves questions around critical thinking around, do I really need to use AI on this task? So, put all those together, you can develop a fairly useful strategic framework.
I want to move to the topic of transparency now, and this has a lot of different aspects to it, and from what we talk about, like legitimate, in inverted commas, use of AI with internal and external stakeholders, to how decision makers are thinking about implementing AI and the impact that this might have on employees, and then how employees might be choosing to use AI with or without the knowledge or following guidelines of the rest of the organization. So where do you start on the transparency issue when you want to tackle that with stakeholders? How do you talk to people? Where do you start?
It's a great question. I mean, transparency is only one part of the equation, because you mentioned legitimacy, and that's the most important element. So there's a trust penalty to pay if we are open about our AI use, either as individuals or organizations, where the stakeholder considers, or the organization considers, it to be illegitimate use or non-viable use. And so that this is a very important question. It's fundamental that we need to, and a huge opportunity for public relations, because essentially this is a general revolutionary technology that is sweeping the world, and attitudes to it are weird, they're inconsistent, they are contradictory sometimes, they're difficult to, and they're specific to particular sets of stakeholders. So I think, we're essentially, as public relations practitioners, one of our jobs is going to have to be to research and boundary span amongst our colleagues and our external stakeholders to understand their views in order to understand what they consider to be legitimate use. Because we will need as organizations to adjust our usage based upon their views and opinions, and we're going to end up having to be in dialogue. We might have to persuade people that actually our use is legitimate. But what we're seeing is a really interesting, and this is where I'm most interested in this, is some very, very interesting changes in the views of different types of people in relation to AI. So the King's Institute for AI a couple of weeks ago published a brilliant study looking at our view of AI in the UK in relation as employees and employers. And actually, interestingly enough, both employees and employers have a pretty negative view about the impact of AI on jobs. So, over 2/3 of us think that it's going to have results in reduction of employment. Now, the way we differ is employees think that those jobs aren't necessarily going to be replaced by other types of jobs where employers are more positive. But you can see if that's a generally held viewpoint, which according to this research is, the deployment of artificial intelligence within an organization is going to have to be handled very carefully. It's going to have to be a very delicate change management if you want to do it successfully, because these are people who quite perhaps legitimately are considering that that deployment might threaten their livelihoods. And then more broadly, we appear to be seeing a bifurcation in society in relation to views in relation to AI across the world, where we have sections of society whose views are hardening. So creative industries, for instance, they appear to be sort of doubling down on artificial intelligence, and it's very interesting to see this. So there may be types of organization where they're unable to reconcile the use of artificial intelligence with the behaviors and beliefs of their key stakeholders.
There's all this sort of like interplay between geopolitics and lots of different viewpoints which create as well these tensions. I know, for instance, China actually has recently passed a law prohibiting companies from making employees redundant for the sake of AI implementation, because they say that it harms society as a whole. And I think that that's an interesting and a brave stance to take. I definitely don't see it happening here in the UK anytime soon. So it's just interesting to see how different, like you said, different demographics, different groups, and also different countries and regions will adapt and push back on certain things, and other things they won't.
The way that we think about artificial intelligence and jobs is very crude. So if we think about an industry's vulnerability to artificial intelligence, we often consider it in relation to tasks. So we look at a job, we look at its key tasks, and we go, yeah, we map those against artificial intelligence. And that's what's happening in some of these companies. They are, looking at a series of job description tasks and going, well, AI can do that. And they're making decisions about their workforce on that basis. The problem with that approach is that it misunderstands what jobs are. A task-based analysis, I call it the difference between the body and the skeleton. The skeleton is the series of tasks in the job, but there's a lot of interconnective tissue, blood flow, circulation, tendons and ligaments, which is a metaphor for interpersonal relationships,
the soft skills.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, what's often called tacit knowledge, but also even things like heuristics. So for instance, our capacity to intentionally or otherwise influence each other, even unintentional influence, It needs to be taken into account in lots of different jobs. So it's not even sometimes it's not even a skill. It's like soft accidents. But you put that all together, a job is much more than the sum of its tasks. Mm. And the problem with the current approach to looking at workforces is they're making this what's essentially a category mistake, and it's going to, and in some cases, like I think it was Klarna, I think was a classic one, where they made people redundant and then very quickly rode back on that. And Gartner, I know recently had a report out saying that a sizable proportion, I think it was over 50% of organizations making customer service representatives redundant because of AI will be rowing back on those decisions within 12 to 24 months.
I mean, it's super interesting, and I think that looking at the bigger picture of business, I think that PR has a really vital role to play in terms of that listening, consulting, talking to the rest of the organization, because this is so needed when all of these decisions are taking place.
Yeah, I mean, Stephen Waddington wrote a blog that I think was published today, which he's really good at summarizing really difficult concepts really simply or straightforwardly, I should say. And he wrote a sort of sentence which is, just at the point in which public relations is going to become more valuable because of AI risks kicking the rung of the ladder to get into public relations.
And looking at that bigger picture, would you say that the PR industry as a whole, what do they need to get right on AI? What do we need to stand for? And what position do you think that we need to take, especially when we think about industry bodies? Do they need to do more?
Well, I'll come to industry bodies in a bit, but I'll just think about us as teams and functions and individuals. I mean, Elif Guvensia in a really great essay called The Two Clocks Framework, and Simon Bow in his Substack, who's the former head of comms for the UK government, both write about this, and I do as well. And in summary, what we're saying is, look, if you're output focused, if you're selling outputs to your employer as a team or to your clients, you're in big trouble. Because if you're saying, yeah, what we do is produce content, you're in trouble, because those employers and clients are likely to, not without reason, consider that artificial intelligence to some extent will do a better job. Now, they may be completely wrong about this. But if that's the proposition, then it's difficult to argue against, the sort of automation argument with a little bit of human oversight. But actually, if we're selling, and I use the word selling, as an overview of kind of, of what we're offering, if we're offering judgment, critical thinking, negotiation, nuance, contextual knowledge and understanding, relationship building, internally and externally, say media relations as it's put, it's about developing relationships with media. If that's what we're offering, we're on a much stronger footing. And if we're offering something that's outcome and impact focused, then that's that there's an argument to say that that's now more possible than ever due to the efficiencies that AI can afford us and freeing us up for being better at evaluation and measurement, better at coming up with solutions to that particularly thorny problem. So yeah, I think that's what we need to do. We need to shift from an output offer to an outcome offer, and if we don't, we're toast.
Yeah. And on the industry body side,
I mean, I fair play to both of them, really. Say the CIPR, I think they did a really good early lead. I would say that I'm completely biased because I think I wrote their first paper on AI, a really initial early one on data ethics, and then I've been involved in some of the other. I was part of the AI panel at the beginning, so I'm totally biased. I'm not a very good commentator on that. I think they did a really good job, but I think even the speed of it was very difficult for them to keep up with, and that's probably where, if I'm brutally honest, probably Stephen and I kind of thought, well, let's just try and fill that gap a bit. But I think they've been really good with same with PRCA. They've got some really good publications. I know they've got some great training on that. I think, and IPR's done some really good producer back thinking about America, fantastic papers on our role in supporting strategic adoption of AI within an organization. So actually, I think, generally those bodies and they're trying to change their training off and keep that up, but that's hard because that's a real difficult thing to do for anybody, because partly the market is not particularly sophisticated in buying its training. So it might say it wants something quite advanced, but in the end you might turn up and everybody just wants to be taught on prompts. So there's it's a very bumpy time for training providers, I would imagine.
Yeah, definitely. Finally, tell us where we can get a copy of this lovely book, and what's next for you.
So you can get a Kogan Page website. I think if you put Kogan Page 25, just Google Kogan Page discount, and you will find one, right? And you'll get a discount of it. So I would recommend the Kogan Page site because they will give you a discount. I think it's 25% at the moment. And you'll find that easily by Googling, or you can use the large language model to find the current one, but they've always generally got a discount. So yeah, go and have a look on there and get it from there. If you come to the conference, you get a free copy with your ticket. And yeah, next for me, don't know. I think just continue with, it's really exciting. It's really exciting. I think I'll be developing the consultancy and the training. I'm doing different things. I'm developing some, based on feedback from clients, some sort of new modules. I read about half a day a week, I think, AI stuff. So I'm on a hamster wheel now that's never going to stop until I retire.
Yeah.
I think this is going to dominate the rest of my professional life, understandably. And that's not a bad thing. It's quite an interesting topic. I love learning new things. It's if you do psychological assessment of me, it's always my top thing. Yeah, it's pretty interesting, and it's got lots of, I think probably I'll end up particularly specializing around this question around the human, kind of the topic of your podcast, which is human machine relations. That's pretty much where I'm most interested.
Yeah, and of course, editing new editions of this book every year until it becomes like, I don't know, War and Peace-ish.
There is that. I mean, they haven't asked us yet, so I don't want to presume. And whether I say yes or no, I don't know. And also, the format we do it, because I would imagine some of our contributors be like, "Nah, I'm not doing that again." But I mean, we'll have to see.
That brings us to the end of this episode. Thanks very much to Ben for taking the time to come on the show. What did you think about this episode? Is there anything you'd like to add to the conversation, or any burning question you'd like to ask our expert guests? Drop me your thoughts in the comments, and yours could be mentioned on a future show. If you enjoyed this episode and you want to hear more conversations like this, make sure that you follow Human Machine Relations on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, thanks for listening. And remember, the future isn't just about what machines can do, it's about how we choose to work with them. Bye.